All right. Welcome, everyone. Today I am joined by Midnight Philosopher. We met through a mutual acquaintance, Kevin Nontrad. And as part of it, I had offered to that community people to come onto my channel and either bring their grievances or just have a conversation. And Midnight was one of the very first people to take me up on that offer. So thank you, Midnight.
Thanks for having me, James, aka Catholic
Absolutely.
Thinker. Very fun. I've really enjoyed just all the conversations on Discord that we've had, or sometimes I'm just, if I don't have much to say, I'm just lurking on the Discord, and I think it's fun there. I feel like 99.9% of the time it's just people just thinking out loud together, and despite
Hmm.
coming from a variety of perspectives, I think we're all pretty chill with each other. I like to think we're all pretty much on friendly terms.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do know that sometimes it gets a little heated between myself and one
Mhm.
of the other members, but I think
Mhm.
y'all just break out the popcorn at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Just we're the embodiments of that Michael Jackson with the popcorn meme.
Yep, exactly, exactly.
Mhm,
I know that, I mean, your channel's a little bit bigger than mine. I have yet to
mhm,
break the 100 sub count. You've already broken it.
mhm.
But for those of you who might not know who you are, go ahead and introduce yourself. Give us a little bit of your background.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so I go by Midnight Philosopher in YouTube. I may or may not have appeared on Kevin's channel under a different identity, under my real world identity, but I shall neither confirm nor deny. Just to keep things a little spicy, I will stick with Midnight Philosopher as my online identity. There have been some funny misunderstandings in the YouTube comment section and in on Twitter, that because I use the word philosopher, I give people the mistaken notion that I take myself seriously, which I want to reassure everybody I do not take myself that seriously. And actually, I didn't even come up with Midnight Philosopher. It was when I was living in a college dorm. People noticed that I was posting really late on Instagram, and they kind of gave me that nickname as a
Mhm.
just a little to poke. It was all in good friendly fun.
Yeah.
So it was a very unserious beginning to that name, but I thought it was fun and cool enough, cooler than anything I could have come up with. So I've been using that as my identity to really just think out loud about Catholicism. I mean, I would still self-identify as a Catholic. I probably don't check all the boxes for being the most worthy player on the field, but yeah, I think it's been therapeutic for me to be in Kevin's Discord, hop on Kevin's channel, and to do stuff with friends like you, and just think out loud and talk out loud about these things. I think that's kind of what I feel most comfortable in. I think I alluded
Yeah.
to in the Discord that, like, I'm not always the best at super structured essays or layouts or debates or anything, but I do enjoy just the process of, like, working things out in real time with good natured people around me. So
Yeah.
I hope that that's what my channel's been doing. So I hope that, like, all those essays, maybe people just they find something they resonate with, and it's certainly just been therapeutic for me. It's certainly the opposite of speaking ex cathedra, so nobody expect any kind of theological wisdom there. It's just some dude late at night thinking out loud about a variety of things.
Yeah. And you know, you shared in the Discord, and I forget the guy's name, where he was talking about the right brain Christianity.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
um, and he was touching a lot on uh, effectively the mystic side of Christianity. Do you remember
Mhm.
the channel name?
Yeah, that guy's name is CJ Cornthwaite.
That's it.
He's a Canadian. Um, I I don't remember if he's used this term in particular, but because I can't remember the language he uses, he's something of an ex-evangelical. I think he grew up in a kind of fundamentalist evangelical Christianity of some sort. I don't
Mhm.
remember the particular denomination. And then he was in seminary, and then I think in the course of seminary he lost his faith as he got into the biblical scholarship, and that's kind of his specialty.
Yeah.
But I think, and then yeah. Anyway, his channel's been kind of an exploration of spirituality after being in a
Yeah.
fundamentalist thing. And I love how, I appreciate how respectful he is, because he still, even though he kind of dances around feeling atheist and agnostic, he still cherishes engaging with biblical content in a respectful way. He appreciates the community and the traditions surrounding it. It's just he's sort of sorting out, yeah, I guess, as he said, like, if to sort of paint in broad strokes, if a left brain Christianity is very much about having a correct list of beliefs and dogma that you have to accept, and you have to sort of
Mhm.
logic yourself into, and hopefully logic others into the same boat as you are. In his characterization, a right brain Christianity is much more about that. Yeah, it is like those intangible and mystical elements and the experiential elements
Mhm.
of Christianity. And of course, I think we briefly talked on the Discord too that it's so much more of a spectrum, and it's not that those two
Yeah.
are mutually exclusive. And maybe sometimes it is, if you push it too far in either extreme, you'll come across some deficiencies, and it's hopefully getting those two aspects to work in harmony.
Yes. And so the reason why I brought that up, and you hit it on the point that I was wanting to allude to was, and you kind of brought this up. I am very much on the academic, left brain,
Mhm,
as far as uh, being analytical, logical
mhm,
based. And when I was exploring your channel, listening to the stuff that you wrote, you
mhm,
are definitely more on the mystic side, where
mhm,
it's the musings,
mhm,
there's not as much of a structure there, and that's not a bad thing.
mhm,
It's I feel like your channel is very much one who is in being very vulnerable in exposing himself, as far as like, hey, these are the struggles, and this is just me thinking through the my faith, and I invite you all to walk on this journey with me.
mhm. Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization. Thanks for the kind words, but I think that that does sum up my approach. And yeah, maybe at some point we'll see where life takes me, but maybe to level up the vulnerability would actually be to use my real world identity. But for the time being, maybe there's a certain safety in anonymity and hiding behind a neat AI generated thing that somewhat approximates my real world visage. But yeah,
Mhm.
I think it's certainly easier to be vulnerable online when your real world identity is kind of shielded. And I don't quite remember why or how I ended up choosing that approach to things. But maybe it was that, like, I don't know, maybe as you said, it is I came from a very I was homeschooled for a number of years. I like the kind of grounding of my Catholicism was Baltimore Catechism with a healthy
Same.
dose of like a really healthy dose of like EWTN and a bit of
Yep.
Catholic Answers, although I was never really a radio person, but anytime I was in the car with my parents, Catholic Answers would be there. I wouldn't count Fox News as any kind of catechesis, but I just feel like that added a lot of surrounding context to what faith I was kind of brought up with as a kid. And I would say that probably something like Baltimore Catechism would be rather left brain. It's a very question and answer format, and you sort
Mhm.
of yeah, and even though like those books are not particularly sophisticated in a sense of like they're not telling you what a syllogism is or what
Right.
metaphors are, and they're not giving you like pages and pages of bibliography and footnotes. But I
Yeah.
think it is like, especially in those elementary school years, it is sort of the precursor for that kind of approach to faith, a bit
Mhm.
more left-brained and very structured.
I mean, yeah, like you said, you're not going to be learning the dogma of divine simplicity in
Yeah.
the Baltimore
Mhm.
Catechism.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. You're not gonna run into terms like hypostatic union,
No,
or
no.
anything like that.
So, one of the things that you wanted to really explore was, the harm that tradition can have, and
Mhm.
I thought it was very appropriate. Especially right before we jumped on, Pope Leo made the comment about the online Catholicism,
Mhm.
or the online religion, and how you're not going to get exposed to the real world. And I feel like that was very appropriate for this. I also feel
Mhm.
like that what Pope Francis described it, nostalgic idolatry, is also
Mhm.
very appropriate to the topic that we're going to be exploring today.
Yeah.
If I recall from your one of the videos on your channel, you grew up in a Novus Ordo community as opposed to the FSSP or SSPX community, correct?
Yep. Yeah, that is correct. I grew up in a church in Silicon Valley, actually in California. So the parish is Our Lady of Peace, and absolutely nothing bad to say about that parish.
Hmm.
It's a really good community. I've had so many. I still have lifelong friends from there, and even if I might not see eye to eye with every minute theological point. I just,
Yeah.
the people there are really people of good faith, and
Yeah.
there's a real genuine desire to foster, in the way that they know how, like a good faith community, and they really try to serve also the surrounding community and minister to those in need. So yeah, any criticisms I might make about some of the things I noticed, or some of the more traditional leaning or straight up traditionalist, I just want to make clear that, I even if I come up with something strongly worded, I really do believe that the vast majority of people I've encountered, they are really, people of good faith, and they do
Mhm.
the best they can in their journey. So, but yeah, I did grow up. It was Novus Ordo with a lot of Latin in its DNA, and by that I mean stuff like altar boys only, male only
Okay.
lectors. We have an organ at basically, as long as there's an organist, we only have organ music.
Nice.
And over the years, I think especially during or after Pope Benedict's papacy, they were more conscious about incorporating Latin and stuff.
Okay.
Like the mass parts are pretty much all in Latin.
Yeah.
They're all chants, like the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Sanctus, the Agnus Dei, and all of that. That's all in
Right.
Latin.
Right.
And they started adding antiphons, and Sunday masses all have incense. You have bells at the Eucharist, and communion rail has been
Yeah.
intact since the founding of the that parish. So there's a lot of aesthetic choices that are still very much simpatico with the TLM, although the technically it's a Novus Ordo.
Right. Yeah. Actually, it's funny you say that because so I was born and for the first like 2, 3 years of my life was in California. And what
Oh,
you
nice.
just described was the
Hmm.
complete opposite of how my mom relays growing
Hmm.
up in the Catholic community, where it was definitely a lot more progressive and very untraditional, to the point where she started to get concerned
Hmm.
about the faith formation that we would be receiving. The way that she described it was it was either the bishop or the priest of the church that we were going to was starting to say some things that were very um, anti uh, Vatican, like against what the Pope was teaching. And so she was
Mm.
very concerned about our upbringing.
Mm.
And we ended up moving due to my dad's work, and the church that I grew up with, not to the level that you're describing it, because we
Mhm.
never had an organist, but we did get electric organs. He
Mhm.
wanted pipe organs, but we never ended up getting them. And uh, but there was that love of that tradition there
Mhm.
as well, not at the same level that as you described it.
Mhm.
But I just had to laugh when you shared that, because it was like the complete opposite for me in
Yeah,
California.
that's kind of, oh, if you don't mind me asking, what part of California? Was it north or south?
It was south. Like I said, I was like 3 years old when we ended up leaving.
Mhm.
So I don't even really
Mhm.
remember, but I want to say it was South California.
Do you remember the name of, was it a bishop or a cardinal that was kind of stirring up controversy?
No.
Okay. I'll just drop a name that you might look up later, but I wonder if it's, was it Roger? Bishop Roger Mahoney? I feel like
Yeah.
that name was, well, when my dad was still alive, and in my youth, my dad was very much just reading, like, whatever conservative Catholic publication was there, he was reading
Mhm.
it. And so I always just heard him name dropping the latest scandal or the latest dissenting bishop. So I kind of grew up with this, like, my dad was very much about policing the liberals in the church. So it was kind of a
That's
familiar
funny.
thing.
So, so when you had described yourself as, a traditional Novus Ordo, I was shocked just
Mhm.
because you don't hear those two terms being used commonly.
No, not really. It's kind of a unicorn approach. I feel
Yes.
like, like as you said, and commenting about Pope Leo's words about online Catholicism really paints this like gladiatorial match between like
Yeah.
the felt banners and the guitar music with like the TLM crowd.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think and to kind of touch on the quote by Pope Leo, it's not necessarily the online aspect that's the issue in my opinion. It's the isolatedness that's the issue. And I think what ends up happening, and we'll explore this, um, tradition can very easily turn into an isolationist ideology, whether it's online or in a community. And once you become an isolated community or individual, that's when it becomes dangerous and harmful.
I think that's a very astute observation. It kind of brings to mind two things, and I'm sure you can help me flesh this out about the point of isolation. Like I think it's C.S. Lewis who talks about hell being locked from within, and
Yeah.
I think in some
Him,
way that there's a
and I
certain
think
parallel. Mhm.
no, Dante never says it explicitly, but if you read it carefully, um, the souls in hell in Dante's Inferno are trapped because of their own volition. But yes, C.S. Lewis is the one who expressly talks about hell being locked from within.
Yeah, and I know that metaphor or that image of hell is one that Bishop Barron is quite fond of referring to, rather than just, kind of fire and brimstone. It is
Yeah.
kind of, he likes to refer to it more as that it is kind of an internal spiritual state, a resistance to good and whatever. I hope I'm not butchering that, but it is that
Yeah.
lock from within, and I feel like there's a certain parallel from that kind of extremist to that extremist isolationist tradition where they are locking themselves from within. And I think from their point of view, I think they're very sincere that they think they're doing it for God.
Yep.
But I think there's the risk of when you isolate yourself in that manner in a traditionalist community, you also you fail to see and find God beyond your bubble. And I think that
Yeah.
is important. Like I think, the whole seeing Christ in your neighbor, and your neighbor is more than your immediate TLM crowd. And I think when you lock yourself from within, it is creating a certain kind of hell. I'm not comparing it to the hell, but I think there is
Right.
something hellish about that isolationist thing. And then the second point briefly is I think that whole thing with isolation plays a key role of why COVID was such a radicalizing time for many, both politically, but also I think the TLM really exploded during COVID. And even from the parish that I just mentioned, like some of my friends that I reconnected with a couple of years, I've heard like, parents migrated from what I had already thought was a pretty conservative Novus Ordo, and all
Yeah.
of a sudden the parish that I grew up with, the parish I grew up in, became too liberal for some of these parents, and they went full TLM, and then it was a point of no return in terms of how they approach spirituality and politics. And it is, I
Yeah.
think, exactly as you say, there's something about that isolationist approach that can be very harmful.
Yeah. And with you mentioning C.S. Lewis, have you read? And these are two books that I think any and
Mhm,
every Catholic should read at a spiritually appropriate point in their
mhm,
journey, just because of the fact that it's scary.
mhm,
Is which is The Great Divorce, which you alluded to about it being locked from the inside,
mhm,
as well as the Screw Tape Letters. And both of those, C.S. Lewis does a brilliant job of pointing out that Satan doesn't want you to have your back to God.
mhm,
All he needs is you to have your focus on God shifted 1 degree to the left
mhm,
or to the right.
mhm.
Just
Because
1 degree.
that's all that's needed for you to no longer travel in a straight line, basically.
Exactly.
Mhm,
And at that point, it's easy for the individual to lie to themselves. Um, as I described it to someone, is God demands and requires that he be number one in our lives.
mhm,
He doesn't demand and doesn't require that he be one of the most important things in our lives. It is the most important thing in our lives. But it's so easy for him to be number two and for us to feel like that's enough.
mhm,
And that's where that and that's why I love Pope Francis's description of the nostalgic idolatry, because it does come from a place where people say, no, this is how we express our love for God. This is how we show that love for God. And they're saying it's for God, but it's really for themselves a lot of times. Now, this is not me saying this is for everyone in the traditional community. But when you put that above what the magisterium is teaching and saying, that's when some self-reflection is needed, I believe, because we're called to be humble and obedient to the magisterium and the vicar of Christ as Catholics. And if we place ourselves above that, then we're in dangerous territory.
Yeah, I think, as you said about people falling in love with their traditions and their liturgies more than God itself, it's like they put so much of an emphasis on the means that they maybe inadvertently neglect the end. They're much more fixated on whether it's the rubrics or the aesthetics and stuff. And that's not to say that in and of itself those things are bad, but
Mm-hmm.
they sort of, it becomes like such a powerful identity marker for them, and
Yeah.
sort of a point of pride. And it's weird. I don't want to I don't want to wrongly judge their interior lives or their intentions or their states, but I guess the impression that it could leave upon observers is that I think just the nature of the for lack of a better word, this is probably not the best word, but I'm either flamboyance or opulence or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
of just there's a certain grandeur to the TLM and just
Yeah.
that whole approach to tradition. I think sometimes it can give the wrong impression of, like, the Pharisees in the street corner that's like, look at how prayerful I am. Like, look how much I love God. And that's not to say that that's what the people of the TLM crowd, that's
Mm-hmm.
not to say that that's their intention, but
Right.
it's a very easy impression that they could unwittingly leave upon people that are not within their inner circle.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm reminded of when I was in seminary, there were a couple of individuals who expressed sorrow at the fact that the Pope was no longer wearing the papal crown. Now, they understood why, but they liked the grandiose aspect of it because for them it helped showcase how important or how uh, the respect due to that office. Now, they also understood and saw the wisdom in not having the papal crown, but it was just kind of like a man, that was cool. Kind of like how, young boys growing up are like, man, knights in armor, that's cool.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Is this an appropriate time to sort of use the everybody's favorite word, that there's an element of LARPing or live action role playing? And yeah, it's
So,
like it's like I don't want to trivialize that.
yeah,
I think there's a beauty in um symbolism is beautiful.
yeah.
There's I don't know if this is an actual word, but there's some person that I follow on Instagram. I think he's a Mormon guy. His name is Tanner Guzzi, and but his whole shtick in the last 10 years is like talking about men's style and clothes and masculinity and all of that stuff.
Mhm.
But he has this word that he might have been the one to coin it. I'm not sure, but he talks about extegrity, which is like whatever you do in the outside to sort of be an honest expression of what's in the inside. And maybe for trads, that's maybe all of the pomp and circumstance and the dress, that maybe for them it is, hopefully for them, they really hope that they're externalizing their internal spirituality, so
Yeah,
maybe there is a certain amount of quote unquote extegrity about it.
yeah. And, to be charitable and look at it in the best possible light, yes, absolutely. I think that is the case, and that's where they're coming from.
Mhm.
Um, and something that you had shared with me before was, or at least the sense that I had gotten in our conversations and from the stuff that I've seen on your channel, is you're going through a process right now where you are deconstructing the harm that you experienced from this overemphasis on the past, on tradition. Um, is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, I think that absolutely is pretty accurate. I think there's a lot of harm. I also want to add a little awkward clarification about that, because I have to
Mhm.
also take accountability that I would say the vast majority of the harm from of my experiences was absolutely self-imposed, in the sense that my parents were strict, and my mom is
Yeah.
still very faithful, and it's just so baked in. Like, I'm from a Filipino American family, and that's just, it's kind of like Filipino Catholics, Mexican Catholics, Irish Catholics. It's like, not only is it your religion, but it's so baked into your culture. And so I think there's something about the practice of religion that's so second nature. And I think
Mhm.
temperamentally too, I think my parents' generation of Filipinos, like temperamentally, that the boomer generation is just more conservative and strict in how they
Yeah.
ran a household and all of that. So I'm of course, yes, there was that strictness, but I think also they were fairly balanced. Like, they weren't, of the homeschooling community, they certainly weren't the most restrictive. They could be, easygoing about certain things, like maybe video games or watching certain movies. Um, as long as I put a pillow in front of my face during the sex scenes, I was allowed to watch James Bond movies.
Yeah.
So I could get away, and then, um, but I think temperamentally, as a kid, I was just so inclined to, I was just a rule follower, and I was very much about, if you could appeal to my sense of duty, I would follow through to the best of my ability, even if it burned myself out. And I think that
Yeah.
is what happened with my, kind of like taking all of those years of Baltimore catechism and internalizing them in the way that I best knew how to. So a lot of the harms that I'm deconstructing are, sometimes I almost think that maybe my channel is like letters to a younger version of myself. I know that sometimes it might seem that I'm preaching against others, and maybe there is a little bit of that too, that I have particular characters in the trad world in mind. But I think there's also a sense of, like, if I had a time machine and I could sit myself down and, tell myself to take it easy and to catch your
Yeah.
breath and look at the beauty around you, and what can you learn from people of different cultures and different faiths. Don't take yourself too seriously. um I think, yeah. Sorry, I'm rambling, but you're right.
You're fine.
I am kind of deconstructing the harms from that kind of
Yeah.
approach, but also just
I,
taking accountability that I totally, like, kind of put the boot on my own face.
I I mean, I do find it fitting that with it being the title of, to hell with
Mhm,
tradition, and as you described, like it's
mhm,
more of like how tradition can lead you to a kind of hell,
mhm,
and with the way that the Catholic Church describes it as, and as C.S. Lewis beautifully put it, that hell's being locked from the inside.
mhm.
I find it kind of fitting a little bit that you acknowledge that it might have been a little self-inflicted.
Yeah, I guess so. I exactly. I metaphorically locked the door on myself.
Yeah.
Funny how that works. I don't know. Life has a strange poetry about it, and sometimes it hurts, and sometimes it heals.
So, if you don't mind sharing, like,
Mhm,
uh, you had mentioned, like, one of the things that I found really fascinating in your channel was the kind of like your deconstruction of hell,
mhm,
where you had described hell as being isolated from your family, where heaven is that being in union with your family, at least in your musings on that video. And so I get from kind of the opposite from that, that one of the things that really, I don't know if traumatized is the right word, but that hurt you growing up was what is hell, or this fire, brimstone, or whatever view of hell you were given. Would you mind sharing a little bit more on that?
sure. I mean, I'm trying. Yeah, I don't have the word for word Baltimore Catechism thing, but whatever
Yeah.
was in the Baltimore Catechism thing, just the eternal separation from God, and then the loss of eternal life, and
Yeah.
also the fact that you could land yourself there through one unconfessed mortal sin. It wasn't even that it's not the summation of your good and bad acts placed on a weighing scale. It was kind of like, if you slip up once and you get hit by a car, we don't know your destiny, buddy. It might not end so well for you. So I think there was very much that kind of neuroticism growing up, that, oh, I saw this, or I watched this, or I said this, and
Hmm.
I think that certainly weighed heavily, especially as, you're in your double digit ages, and you start to develop a more sophisticated sense of reason, and you can run these internal calculations about the state of your salvation. um so I think that weighed heavily. Like, I certainly had a phase of scrupulosity where I could go to confession, once a week, once every 2 weeks, and sometimes it might not even be that I repeated a sin. That sometimes I would just, like, oh, did I word it correctly? Was I too vague? Was I too
Yeah.
easy on myself and how I confessed it? So there was a lot of that stuff. So in like experientially, that was certainly a kind of hell, but there was also just this very dread of like punishment is on the other side of this. Um and so I think I just had that growing up, a lot of that. And again, like my parents weren't, I mean, they would do what good parents do and they would reinforce whatever the church said, but they weren't particularly, they really didn't employ threats of hell or whatever.
Mhm.
I mean, they would, remind me if they felt that I was straying from a path of virtue, or I was lax in my, Catholic practices, they would certainly like remind me, but they really didn't. I think I just took that stuff so seriously that I imposed that fear of hell on myself growing up.
Yeah.
So that's where I started. Was part of that question too? Did like how I arrived at whatever thing I was musing about on that video, or?
Well, you if I remember it
Mhm,
correctly, you did go through like how you arrived at that in the video, but it was just
mhm,
more of the harm that you had experienced, and you had mentioned like the Baltimore Catechism,
mhm,
and I wonder if, because this is something that I lament even within the Novus Ordo community, is, and I mentioned it in one of my conversations with Kevin as well, is what I call surface level understanding, and I've been trying to think of a better phrase for it,
mhm,
but it's that simplistic, that where it gives you just enough to knowledge where you'll be okay, but any, like, if you start thinking about it too hard, it can cause problems and confusion, like you had said, well, if you, let's say you live a completely virtuous life and then you commit one mortal sin and you die before you can repent of it, then
mhm,
doesn't matter, you're damned to hell.
mhm,
And I've heard that fear, and it doesn't make sense to me, because that's not how I view sin, as a list of good and bad things, like
mhm,
a scale. Like we constantly talk about, or a lot of mythologies talk about the judgment being a set of scales.
mhm.
And I look at our relationship with God as just that, a relationship. Um, it doesn't matter how long you've been with your significant other. It doesn't matter how many good things you've done for that significant other. You cheat once, they have every right to kick you out the door,
Mhm,
and that relationship is over.
mhm.
And that's what a mortal sin is. Now, I know a lot of people don't think of mortal sins in that capacity, but that's what they are. And what I wonder is, it's bad enough in the Novus Ordo, where people have an overly simplistic understanding. And I'm wondering if, in their love for the pomp and circumstance, a lot of the traditional Catholics view that pomp and circumstance for theological depth, and thus trick themselves into thinking that they know the faith better, but they still have that simplistic understanding.
That's a good that's a good question, about that. Like, I hadn't particularly thought about it in those terms, but I think that that is like a very insightful criticism. Um, I'm trying to think that, yeah, because that's really incisive commentary. Um, but you are right in terms of like the simplistic understanding. Like, I guess I would file Baltimore Catechism in being pretty simplistic and black and
Yes,
white with no
it's
gradations.
meant to be a
Mhm. Yeah,
simplistic
and yeah,
understanding.
for sure. I think at that age, you can't really expect kids to have mastered abstract and metaphorical thinking and
No,
stuff. But yeah,
you try
kind of
telling a kid
going.
that God is purely
Mhm.
simple and his justice is the same as his love.
Yeah,
Uh, they're going to be super confused.
yeah. I think maybe kind of latching on to something that you'd said about the analogy of mortal sin. Kind of like violating your most intimate relationship, I think,
Hmm.
rather than just like, like that metaphor. And I think maybe therein is also a little bit of an issue, at least in my experience, where wasn't until maybe more than a decade later, even maybe more recently, maybe the last three-ish or five-ish years or something, where it dawned on me that, like, I don't think I've ever really thought of, or maybe I realized I don't have much of an understanding of what a relationship with God is, in the sense that it always did feel like measuring myself up against a set of abstract beliefs or
Hmm.
abstract criteria, and running this internal calculation of, am I
Yeah.
worthy to receive communion and Sunday mass? And so in that
Yeah.
sense, it only recently dawned on me that it really didn't feel quite personal. And so I know you'd mentioned that my channel feels very much like right brain Catholicism, or musing and mysticism, and that's
Yeah.
definitely like a late onset thing for me, because I don't know why, but I think, kind of going back to that thing of I was a serious kid. I was very much bound by a sense of duty. If you could appeal to my sense of duty, you could get me to do pretty much anything unless it was
Yeah.
obviously immoral. And I think maybe my sense of duty and obligation was so powerful that I didn't realize that maybe I didn't exactly have a relationship with God in a deep sense. As you
Hmm.
said, that there's a much richer understanding of that, with more gradations, and it's not overly simplistic. So that is something that maybe I'm groping in the darkness for, that I'm trying to
Yeah.
figure out what exactly that is, or what that feels like, because I think I've had such a left brain understanding of the abstractions and the technicalities, but
Hmm.
yeah, I'm that's kind of the idea of an intimate relationship, at least at an emotional level.
Yeah.
um it does seem like, I have to admit, I don't know what that is.
Yeah. And I think that's a problem within our society, and it's something that I'm working on. I'm actually working on a script exploring that idea, as far as the effect that Western civilization, especially now that we're in this post-skeptic period after the likes of Kant and Descartes, even if you've never read them, you've been affected by them. And now everyone has to be left brain in order to seem not just smart but wise.
Hmm.
And for those D&D nerds out there, there's a difference between intelligence and wisdom. you know and I think nowadays we've combined the two together, and it's gotten rid of that more creative side of things. If you don't mind, Midnight, I want to pause real quick and answer a question from the chat.
Sure.
Will had asked, can a non-Catholic commit a mortal sin? As far as like that analogy that I used, as far as like that marriage. So for those that are not familiar with the Catholic doctrine, as far as like what constitutes a mortal sin, is it first needs to be grave matter. The second requirement is that you need to know that it's grave matter. And the third requirement is that you need to freely choose to do it anyways. Now, there's still lots of theological debate as far as what that constitutes as, but yes, it is still possible for a non-Catholic to commit a mortal sin, because a sin is anything that harms your relationship, not just with God, but your fellow man and yourself. Now, God's always going to be involved in any aspect of that, but the a non-Catholic can absolutely commit a mortal sin, and an easy one would be murder. Um, we all know through our natural reason that murder is wrong. We all know that it's seriously wrong, and those that do it freely, anyways, would still have committed that mortal sin at that point, because it's a sin against their fellow man. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Midnight? Or
Sure. I think, yeah, what grave matter, full knowledge, full consent, and there is a huge, um because something could be, a matter could be objectively grave and objectively mortal, but then there's the issues of subjective culpability,
Mhm.
your ability to reason, and maybe external factors that were imposing a certain kind of stress,
Yeah.
or maybe your will wasn't particularly free because of coercion. But you are right to point out, I think murder is the easiest one, because I think there's something so primal about wanting to defend your life and the life of loved ones, that I think there's a natural empathy if we don't want to see the destruction of another life, that at some level we all, we might not use the same language, but I think at the most intuitive level, we have a sense that life is sacred, and we might
Yeah.
express that in different ways, but I think that is the most intuitive.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there are a lot of other things that maybe when it comes to like how to handle money or certain things pertaining to marriage and intimacy and family planning, where there's a lot more gray area in terms of subjective culpability, where I think there's a greater discussion to be had about, does it fulfill all three criteria of
Yeah.
of mortal sin.
Yeah. And it's definitely, and that's why, me personally, I don't like answering questions of like, well, is this a mortal sin? And it's like, because it goes back to that question of
Mhm,
personal relationship with God. Like, well, what is your relationship with God at this point? What is your
mhm,
relationship with your fellow man at this point?
mhm,
And that's a question that only yourself can answer. I can't answer it for you.
mhm,
Um, and I know that there's a lot of other psychological, uh, like OCD and other uh, psychological effects that lead to scrupulosity. But I think the biggest underlying factor for scrupulosity is this idea that you can put everything into a checkbox, and if everything matches these checkboxes, then we can know definitively.
mhm,
And that goes back to that Western civilization post skeptic ideology that I was describing, where we if we have to claim that we know something, we have to know it with absolute uh, certainty at that point.
mhm, mhm. That's a good point. Maybe a couple more things that came to mind about, because you had mentioned how there's a lot of, I forgot, I don't know if you use gray area, but there's a lot of, finer points about mortal sin, and two contrasting examples that I would maybe illustrate is, like maybe the sort of, what's the word? Sorry, I'm brain farting. I can't quite remember the
You're
word I
fine.
want to do. But like, oh, maybe mascot is a good word. Like the mascot for the trad world might be someone like Father Chad Ripperger, and he's of the opinion that most people live in a state of habitual mortal sin. But I've come across a priest from the East Coast, and in his mind, mortal sin is exceedingly rare, in the sense that he thinks that there needs to be a conscious internal disposition of turning away from God and rejecting God's goodness, that there's something much more mindful, like you can't slip into a mortal sin.
Yeah.
um and then some, yeah, and I think that does highlight, maybe those are two really painting in broad brushstrokes, so there's certainly gradations there, but I think that could encapsulate like the a trad approach. Like, it's very common for me to hear stuff from the pulpit in my childhood church, even to this day, that some priests will overemphasize, like, oh, this mortal sin, like, oh, you miss mass on the Sunday, automatic mortal sin, or you're a married couple using contraception, automatic mortal sin, and you have to go to confession, with no nuance for each situation,
Hmm.
where we could perhaps say that objectively the things that were just mentioned are grave matter, and so
Yeah.
we can't take those things lightly. But
Yep.
could we maybe study the situation and the dispositions of the people involved, so that they're extenuating circumstances? And then on the Novus Ordo side, like more of the chilled out, most parishes, I don't think I've ever heard them mention mortal sin, and obviously, I don't think that the point is that they're doing away with it, but they
Right.
they they do seem to be gesturing more towards, in that way that you were talking about, like having a relationship with God, and maybe conceiving of sin more as an orientation, and like wanting to switch your orientation towards things that are higher or more
Hmm.
virtuous, and rather than sort of nickel and diming you for every single thought and action, even if they might use kind of hippy dippy superficial language that's, maybe too fuzzy for the trads. I think that I do feel that in terms of the gesture that a lot of Novus Ordo parishes are trying to make, they're trying to reorient the whole disposition.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying that trads don't do that. I think there's the hope that all the externalities and the pomp and circumstance can affect
Yeah.
your internal disposition, but there's also just a lot of nickel and diming that, even if it's not their intention, I think it could trigger OCD and scrupulosity just by that particular approach to, sin, rooting out sin and the spiritual life.
Yeah. And something as far as like that you had pointed out, as far as like, that reorientation as far as going on within the Novus Ordo after Vatican II. Um, I think that's where a lot of the fear came from is, you had this tradition that people could say had lasted, for a millennia at the very least. Because, contrary to what a lot of people think, when the Latin Mass and the Roman Missal first came to be, it was not the way that it was always done. If you want an example of how the Mass was always done, read the Didache.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as when the church did that refocus and that reorientation, it was because, like you had said, that nickel and dime feeling that was becoming pervasive within the community. And that's not what God is, or that's not what God wants. He wants a relationship. And if you read the lives of the saints and you read the lives of the mystics and, the way they talk about their relationship with God, even though they went to confession on a daily basis, it wasn't because of a nickel and dime feeling, but it was because, no, I want to serve God as best as I can. But for those that don't have that relationship, it from the outside, it looks like a nickel and dime approach. And so that's what they imitated.
Mm-hmm. So it almost becomes like a cheap Timu knockoff of actual spirituality.
I like how instead of saying the cheap China knockoff, we now say cheap Timu knockoff when
Yeah,
it's
maybe
actually
it's
the same thing.
it's the same thing, but for some reason maybe Timu is a little bit more politically correct because it's not very directly racist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, and I think that's what drives a lot of people to the trad community is, and you raised an interesting point as far as the influx in the trad community from your perspective after COVID. It would be interesting to see if there was a correlation to that. But people were isolated, and and so all they had was just time at that point, and so they started looking into it, and they started seeing something that looked deeper than what they were used to, and the beauty spoke to them. Because don't get me wrong, like the mass in because I've been to a Latin mass and it's beautiful. I still prefer the Novus Ordo
Hmm.
for different reasons that I think subtly teach things theologically, and I can see why the church did what she did when she updated the missal. But if you don't know what those theological reasonings are, it's very easy to see the beauty in the Latin Mass and think, oh, well, that's just better and more holy than the Novus Ordo. But it's the same Christ.
Hmm. Yeah. I agree with you. I mean, even though I think I've attended one or two Latin masses in my lifetime, like TLMs. I think I unfortunately didn't have the attention span to completely appreciate it. But like now, even like, in my 30s, I I've been curious like of attending a Latin mass just to see what it's all about. But I've certainly listened to Gregorian chant in isolation, like
Yeah.
not in a mass context, and it's some pretty epic stuff. It's beautiful, and I think there really is something I think there's something innately human. And the reason why I say innately human, I don't mean to take like a Western style of music and just have it, represent all of humanity, but there is something in the sense that I think there's a certain overlap between Gregorian chant, and like Buddhist chanting or the Islamic call to prayer. I think there's something about solemn vocal
Hmm.
music that there is something maybe universal in that style of solemn human vocal music, that it taps into something primal about how we sort of as a human race, how we express that religious impulse that is in us in some way, shape, or form. And I
Yeah.
do think that I think it's fair to say that Gregorian chant, it does have something that taps into that shared instinct of how humans tend to express that sort of spiritual solemnity.
Hmm. No, absolutely. Now, something that I was hoping for when I extended the invite was, to answer a challenging question you had, or uh, something that you were angry. I don't know if that's the right term, but at least like something that you were angry with the church on or hurt on the church on that I could potentially offer some insight. Um, was there anything that you know you've been looking into or been hoping to find an answer for as part of your journey that I might be able to help with?
Sure. Wow, a big wide open field there. But maybe let's start with something that maybe touches a lot of people's concerns. I imagine that our friends in Discord might have, but maybe exploring just the question of like the exclusivity of salvation, or like extra ecclesiam nulla
Yeah,
salus, and all of its various articulations about how without Jesus there is no salvation and stuff. And
yeah,
so what's a way that we can understand that, but also in what way can we make that make sense, where I just feel like maybe the difficult thing that I haven't wrapped my head around is how can we accept that, but also find a way to still make Catholicism compelling to outsiders without kind of beating them over the head of like, this is your only way out, buddy. If you don't
yeah.
join us, you're doomed. And
Where's the
I
happy
kind of feel,
medium between the two, right?
yeah, exactly. Like I guess like maybe I've just digested too much trad content post COVID, that maybe
Yeah.
I've lost sight of how do we make sense of Christ as a path to salvation,
Hmm.
and yet communicate a gospel without that what seems to be at a superficial, like maybe like you said, maybe understanding it at a theologically superficial level makes it feel like it's just like, guns are pointed at you and you got to make the right call.
Yeah. So I've actually written on this subject already, and I'm working on trying to get that into a video format. Most of my blog posts are on Reddit, and I've come to find out that a lot of people, rightfully so, have a bad view on Reddit. And so I've been trying to find a good medium that I can start putting my thoughts to when I'm writing it out. But the interesting thing is the phrase outside the church there is no salvation was first used, and I forget the name of him, but it was by an individual who was arguing that a baptism by a heretic is invalid, so they needed to be rebaptized in the Catholic Church. And I believe it was Pope Stephen, but anyways, like the Pope that was like contemporary to him or right after him said no, that's not true. It's why, as a Catholic, we accept Protestant baptisms because they are valid. But if we were to take the original intent of outside of the church, there is no salvation, we wouldn't be able to accept a Protestant baptism.
Mhm.
So it had nothing to do with it. You need membership of the church. The original phrase was exclusively about whether or not a baptism offers salvation if it's offered outside of the church. And the
Okay.
church said yes.
Oh, okay, that's interesting.
Now, you also have St. Augustine who talks about the kingdom of God or the city of God, I'm sorry. And he talks about how there's members or people that appear to be members of the city of God that are actually a part of the camp of the enemy, and that there are members of the city of God that are currently residing in the camp of the enemy. Now, he doesn't say at what point they become members of the city of God, but regardless, they are still a part of the enemy's encampment, whether that's visibly or a member of visibly a member of the enemy's encampment, but invisibly a member of the city of God. And then the other council that is referred to is the Council of Florence, and the whole passage is, we profess and believe in one church of the faithful, outside of which no one can be saved. And then it continues on to talk about how the Catholic Church is the one with the sacrament of the Eucharist, and then continues on after stating that we're the only one with the Eucharist to talk about baptism, which is how one becomes a member of the Church of the Faithful. But the Church of the Faithful is not exclusive to the visible Catholic Church. And then you also have Thomas Aquinas, who talks about implicit faith, where they are just as validly a member of the faith community, even if they are not explicit in professing their faith. And so what Vatican II did was it took all of these ideas that were dissipated, that had always been taught by the Catholic Church, and put them together to help clarify what she meant by outside of the church there is no salvation. One can absolutely be a member of the church through baptism of desire. I think the martyrdom of the Chaldeans, excuse me, because I am recovering from a cold. I am on like the last days of it. Give me just a moment.
No worries. No worries.
The Chaldean martyrs, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but recently there was people who were martyred, and one of the martyrs was never even baptized, but on the witness of those who were executed said, "No, I believe in the same God that these guys do." And he was executed on the spot for it. Never received a water baptism, never received a Trinitarian baptism of "I baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit." And you might think that this is extreme, but I have spoken with some Catholics who, when I try to point out martyrs who were said to have been executed before they could be baptized, they said, nope, they had to have been baptized by water and the Trinitine formula in some way before they were martyred. That had to have happened. We just don't have records of it happening. Well, here we have a record, indisputably, of someone being martyred for their faith before they ever had an opportunity to be baptized. And the church has always taught that an individual like that is a member of the faith. And all the church is saying is that we don't necessarily know who or how, but God is bigger than the church. And yet it's still through the church, as in the Church of the Faithful, which extends bigger than the Roman Catholic Church, that all men are saved.
Okay. No, thanks for that. That's a really beautiful and thorough exploration of the topic. And I'm sure that I think that even further discussion would merit its own stream. But that also adds some context to, like, I know that Bishop Barron has gotten flack for, I think, when he was talking to Ben Shapiro, and he referred to Catholicism as the privileged way, and he didn't want to make any definitive declaration that, if you're not a Catholic, you're not saved. And I imagine he was alluding to a lot of what you said, and maybe tying it back to the idea of traditionalism is that maybe the traditionalists have placed a disproportionate amount of importance on the visible church, and like, because nothing's more visible than a whole lot of incense and lace, and then just the
Yes.
opulence. And again, that I'm making fun of it maybe with my language, but I don't mean to disrespect the beauty of ritual and symbolism, but I think there's so much emphasis on the ritual, the pomp, and the circumstance, which is very visible and very sensory, but at the exclusion, like you said, that there are people that everybody's journey is so different, and they might not be explicitly Christian or explicitly Catholic, but you know even if it's just by one degree, that maybe their soul is you know so gradually reorienting itself into a good direction. and
Yep.
and I'm and that's what I understand in your explanation, that that beyond the bounds of the Roman Catholic Church or the visible church is that
Yep.
everybody has a spiritual journey, and the hope is that everybody's soul is being reoriented to where we're supposed to be. And
Yeah.
that's not always a straight line, and we might, two steps forward, three steps back, and we just got to keep, and hopefully everybody is on some version of that internal reorientation, no matter
Yeah.
how far gone we might seem.
No, absolutely. And like, if you one of the things that I've encountered a lot when I have spoken to those who disagree with Vatican II is they're they want to ignore that nuance, which doesn't make sense to me. Like, they talk about how they have the true understanding, but Catholicism has such infinite depth to it. I'm trying to remember who said it. It's often attributed to Saint Augustine, but it's not. But it was a commentary on the book of Job, and the commentator was talking about how the Old Testament or the Bible is shallow enough for a child to play in, but deep enough for an elephant to drown. And that applies to the Catholic faith as well. But I feel like that there's this desire for an almost simplicity while declaring that it's infinitely deep within the the traditionalist community. Now, to be fair, Novus Ordo, I think, is on the complete opposite issue a lot of times, where they might know that it's infinitely deep, but they don't care enough to go and look into its nuances. And right now, we're trying to find, as a entire church community, we're trying to find the happy medium, I feel, between those two extremes of believing that you have the infinite depth and not looking, or knowing that there's infinite depth and not caring.
Yeah, no, that's a really, I think, astute observation. I have a couple things. First,
Yep.
like a knock on the traditionalists, and then maybe a knock on the Novus Ordos. But with the traditionalists, I think the harm of that approach, there are two major harms that I can. Well, there are many, but I think the two that come to mind. Um, First, I think that system of focusing on the visual church, and then all the stuff we were talking about the fear of hell, and the sort of nickel and diming approach to sin, and running those calculations that could kind of really fray your nervous system, and maybe
Mhm.
treating God as this, in a sense. I mean, I know that God is so real to them, but he does end up being like kind of an abstraction, like this distant, you know, divine monarch, so to speak. And I think that if you follow that system so seriously, and maybe this is projection of my younger self. I don't want to speak for all traditionalists, but I do think that in the long term, I can't see that being a healthy motivation for striving to live a good life. It's sort of like, you know, like I don't think that you can love your parents or love your spouse entirely just out of a sense of duty and obligation. I think there has to be
Yeah.
something more than that. And duty and obligation have their place, absolutely. I don't want to discount the importance of those things, but I think if it's just kind of this servile, I'm forever unworthy and I need to dread the loss of heaven and I have to observe all of these technicalities, I think that that could really fray your nervous system and fray your internal spiritual state. I think that it's unsustainable for really, a healthy spirituality. And the other thing with the kind of, again, with like the isolationist thing and observing what happened with the uptick in radical traditionalism after
Yeah.
COVID, I think the risk here is, I think the strength of Catholic tradition also is kind of a bit of a double-edged sword, in the sense that I think we certainly live in a time which is, and I'm not against multiculturalism. I
Hmm.
love it. I love learning from other
Yeah.
cultures' music, food. I enjoy what we have in America, and I think, and I hope that we I know there's a lot of political and cultural tensions, but I hope we come to a place where we can kind of celebrate our multiculturalism, even with all, warts and everything. I know it has its challenges, but I think in a time of great insecurity, particularly in America, that the structure of Catholicism has kind of become a source of cultural identity,
Yeah.
especially that, like, you know, maybe it's possible to make that we could, let's say, accuse the more progressive folks of overcorrecting, uh, in such a way that even if their heart's in the right place, we could say that it's triggered a lot of white Western insecurity about cultural identity and belonging in what they feel is their own land. And I think that
Yeah.
traditional Catholicism has become a bludgeon in the culture war. And I think
Yeah.
that's the other thing with, and it provides something that is very primal. I think we need structure, we need identity, we need a sense of community. Um, and then when you have a lot of political upheaval, and then you have something like COVID, which, literally isolates people because of, all the restrictions, and we're figuring the situation out, like, sometimes day by day, hour by hour. And I think traditionalism has, by appealing to that primal thing, it's also become a bludgeon in the culture war, which is certainly not what we want our faith to be, but that's just kind of where it's at.
Yeah.
Before I comment on Novus Ordo stuff, maybe I'll stop rambling for a bit, catch my breath, and maybe you have something to add there.
Yeah. So as far as like that, I described that phenomenon, and it relates back to that whole point that C.S. Lewis pointed out, as far as like Satan doesn't want you to have your back turned to God. He just wants you to have your focus shifted by 1 degree, where God is now second in your life. And what I find for lot of, and this applies on both Novus Ordo and traditional Catholics, but it's where your political identity or some kind of identity comes first before Catholicism. And, and that goes, like, even if it's just traditional Catholic, why aren't you just Catholic? That's where the harm is coming in from, is people are taking Catholicism to justify a particular worldview instead of adjusting their worldview to be Catholic.
Mm,
And that's where the harm is coming from, again, on both sides. I saw on the Catholicism subreddit where someone was like, I want to have a feminist Bible study. And I was like, well, hold on, hold on, hold on. What do you mean feminist Bible study? First off, what do you mean by feminism? Because I understand that there's a lot of different definitions of that term. So I was like,
mm,
where are you going with this? And unfortunately, it was what I thought it was. And it was her trying to twist the scriptures to fit her worldview instead of her adjusting her worldview to fit the scriptures.
mhm,
And I see that on both sides, where whether it's the traditional or progressive, where they are trying to make the church fit them as
Mhm.
opposed to them changing themselves to fit within the church. And if you read the Great Divorce, especially, that was the sin that all of the people who went to hell were doing is they were trying to make God fit them instead of them transforming themselves.
Mhm. Interesting. Yeah, I know that one quote about hell locked from the inside, but I'm guilty of not having read the Great Divorce, and I never quite got around to finishing Screw Tape Letters, so I have my homework to do from. But I did read Mere Christianity. I think early in high school.
Yeah.
I think it was early in either early in high school or early in
Almost
college. I can't quite
every
remember.
traditional
Mhm.
Catholic, I think, has read Mere Christianity because honestly, that is such a great book.
Yeah, and I think that also just there was that one line of that one section where C.S. Lewis says that like a truly Christian society would be a paradox to many because on societal issues it would seem rather progressive. No, sorry.
Mhm.
On social issues it would be rather conservative, but on economic issues it would be rather leftist or progressive in his assessment. And then it kind of made me I think maybe I was swayed by whatever media I was consuming at a young age, and sometimes it feels like in American politics you're either this side or you're that, and I think it encouraged me to wait, you can actually look issue by issue and kind
Yep.
of make a hopefully make a sensible judgment about how to vote on particular issues, and I remember that particular line
Yeah.
like stood out to me, and I think it was in Mere Christianity, right, where he has the liar, lunatic, or lord
Yes.
not paradox, but like that
Trilemma.
yeah, that trilemma, exactly. I think that's where I first encountered that, so
Yeah. And the what I will say is like if you haven't read the Screw Tape or you haven't finished the Screw Tape Letters, there is a Christian theater group that does a performance of the Screw Tape Letters, and I'll get it over to you. But I've seen both their performance of the Screw Tape Letters, and they used to do. I don't know if they still do it anymore because I didn't see it on their
Mhm,
website. They also used to do a performance of the Great Divorce, and they are fantastic performances, especially the Screw Tape Letters, because
mhm,
C.S. Lewis really did the Screw Tape Letters as kind of like a dark British comedy.
mhm, mhm,
And it's hard to get that sometimes, especially as an American reading it,
mhm,
but the theater performance really did a good job of showing the comedy contained within the the story, and it's a fantastic perspective on that book, so if you get the chance, I greatly recommend seeing that
that
theater
would be pretty
presentation of
cool.
it.
That would be pretty cool. I think sometimes, like, one of my struggles has always been I'm not the most quick or efficient reader. I think maybe it's an attention span thing. Maybe it's just the curse of our generation. We're doom scrolling all the time. But I think I respond pretty well to like movies and theater. Maybe hearing it. There's a kind of immediacy that I'm still working on getting from reading consistently. That's a personal habit issue. It
Yeah,
has nothing to do with the quality of the writing. But yeah, no, I'll
right,
definitely check that out. That's really cool.
but yeah,
Um,
so, we talked on, your kind of critique on the more traditional side, and you mentioned
mhm.
you had something for the novice, side as well.
Yeah, I would, and it something kind of echoing one thing you'd already mentioned that I hope I'm characterizing this correctly or repeating this correctly, but you said that they know that there's a lot of depth, but they don't care to sort of maybe elaborate on that. And I wonder if part of that is sort of like the church's desire to reach out and appeal to everybody, but it's like in appealing to everybody and maybe becoming vague and vanilla, they actually
Mhm,
appeal to no one. And I think there's just the inherent problem of I think there's a lot of things that make sense to us that were brought up in this culture, but there's almost like a you have to learn how to play the language game, or you have to amass a collection of basic literacy on the biblical text and the metaphors and the sort
mhm.
of basic teachings that sort of are the underpinning of our framework. And I wonder, like, how would you bring or how would you bridge that gap? I think that obviously we've that whole I think they're trying to appeal to us, so they've watered things down maybe because that's in their miscalculation, that's the best way to attract new members, which I don't think the stats really bear that out. But how would you reach out? to others and make a compelling case for Catholicism, but also acknowledging that there's a pretty significant disadvantage in terms of people don't have the language and the framework to really even begin digesting these things that we're talking about.
So, and that honestly, this is part of the reason why I'm embarking on the journey that I
Mhm.
am, as far as like what I'm writing and what I'm trying to put out there. But there's someone in one of the Discord servers that I'm in that came from a Baptist community. He's converting to Catholicism, and he started off on this journey of self-discovery where, and it's funny, earlier today he reached out to me saying, "Hey, so the people in charge of my OCIA program, for those that aren't familiar, it's what the church is now calling RCIA, which is the program that helps bring people into the Catholic faith community that weren't baptized into it as infants." And he he listed a couple of things that he came across, asking me for my opinion on it, and both of them were uh, programs that I was already familiar with and that I would have recommended. And so, what I think part of it is the church is encouraging people to go on their own journey, to explore it on their own at their own pace. But a lot of people think, and I had this conversation with someone in the debate a Catholic subreddit, where he didn't even know that the Eucharist was the height and summit of the Mass, that that the purpose of the Mass was the Eucharist. He thought the purpose of the Mass was the Gospel and the homily. No surprise to me, he's no longer Catholic. He's going to a non-denominational community where it is more of a Bible study type uh, community and get together. And he's still convinced that even after I tried to explain to him that the purpose of the Mass is the Gospel and the homily. And I think that's the problem with a lot of the Novus Ordo, is it's not that the church necessarily is speaking a language to welcome everyone. It is trying to stress to people that their faith is in their hands. And because there's one of two things ends up happening from what I'm observing, is either laziness, where they only want to show up on Sunday, be told what to believe, and that's it, and they don't want to explore on their own. And there's nothing wrong with only showing up on Sunday, but if you try to say that that's all you need to do to get everything you know about the faith, then there's a problem there. The second problem isn't necessarily the individual's fault, but it is a natural human response that needs to be worked through. The Catholic Church has 2 millennia of resources available out there. So when you start to try to figure out where you want to go to learn more about the faith, you get into analysis paralysis. But you just got to start somewhere. What is the topic that interests you? Start there. But then people are like, well, what if I start at the wrong spot? Doesn't matter. There is no wrong spot to start. So with the people that are on the Novus Ordo side of things that don't have that knowledge, it comes from either laziness, which I don't think is the majority position, but it is a position that I have seen.
Mhm.
I think the majority position, though, is that analysis paralysis, and they are using that um, to justify them remaining where they are.
That's a I I find even as a Catholic, or cradle Catholic, analysis paralysis never quite let go of its grip on me.
Yeah. I was fortunate where I was too stupid and too stubborn to let analysis paralysis.
Hmm.
Like, I was too stupid to know that that was a thing I should be worried about, and then I was too stubborn where even if it was a thing I would be worried about, it's like, "No, I don't care. I'm starting here. This is what I wanna learn about."
Nice. What do you think are some of the topics that sort of maybe began like your mature intellectual journey where you felt you took the wheel, so to speak, of your own spiritual life? What are some of those topics that really turned James into the Catholic thinker?
So, it's hard for me to give that, and one of the things that I decided like, I've been thinking, I wanna, do a book, like, I wanna write a book, and it finally occurred to me that what I ought to do is kind of like a I'm calling it an FAQ, but it's more of like, "Hey, this is where you can start if you wanna learn about the Catholic faith, that way then you don't need to worry about the, that analysis paralysis." But I started with part of my homeschool curriculum was being taught the Catholic faith, starting with the Baltimore Catechism. Then we moved into the something called the Credo,
Mhm,
CREDO, which is used a lot of times for RCIA, OCIA, but it was a part of my religious education. Then I started reading a series of books by Father John Lau, Laux,
mhm,
who was, I think it was for high school or middle school, but he basically wrote his own syllabus and books for his own classes. And I read those books uh, as part of my faith curriculum. At some point, I read Peter Kreft's Summa of the Summa Theologica
mhm,
before I actually started reading the Summa. And I'm trying to think what else was there. I think those were the major ones that I studied, other than it was just otherwise, it was just someone would ask me a question, and if I didn't know the answer, I'd like, "Well, let me look into it to figure out what the answer to that question is." And
mhm,
even growing up, like, even like I said, like, the books that I read were a lot of commentaries, but they still infused an understanding that if I want an answer to what the church says or what anyone says, read the primary source material. So if I want to know what the Catholic Church says about, as you had asked earlier about salvation outside of the church, read the actual texts.
mhm,
You know, a lot of people say, "Well, no, the church definitively said and used and I forget what the Latin of it is, but the actual phrase for there is no salvation outside the church
mhm,
in the Council of Florence." Well, no, the Council of Florence says the church professes and believes, not declares and defines, as if
mhm,
you watch my conversation with Kevin on infallibility is a key aspect, but professes and believes in one church of the faithful, which outside of which no one can be saved. That's not EENS,
mhm.
whatever, extra ecclesiam.
No less hollows, I think.
Yeah, so,
Mhm,
I forget what the actual Latin is, but the EENS phrase, it's not that phrase.
mhm.
But you ask a traditional Catholic and they'll say, "No, that phrase is in there,"
Yeah.
but it's not. So, it's less of what I read and more of habits that I developed.
Mhm.
Honestly, like, I think one of the things that really helped me in my habits had nothing to do with Catholicism. Sherlock Holmes.
Nice.
And I loved mystery books growing up. My grandparents got me the hardbacks of the first run of the Hardy Boys series,
Oh, I
and
remember that. I don't remember who gifted me that, but yeah, during my homeschooling years, I totally got hooked. I think I got through the first 12 books and I never quite kept up with it, but man, those were addicting.
yes, yes. And then she also got me the Barnes and Noble complete edition, which was like two books that were like this thick and print
Mhm.
this tiny of the entire Sherlock Holmes series, and I loved the analytical aspect. So what turned me into the Catholic thinker was a great love for the Catholic faith and a great love for analytical problem solving. It was those two things together that turned me into the Catholic thinker, and so it was me applying a great desire to be analytical to the Catholic faith. And that's why, like, when people ask, well, what did you read that turned you in, like, it
Hmm.
wasn't one thing. It was a 20 plus years that have led me to this, because I started studying the faith in depth with a great love and passion when I
Hmm.
was like 6 to 8 years old.
Hmm.
Because when I was 4 years old, I was already telling my mom I wanted to be a priest.
Hmm. Yeah, you had that fire in you.
Yes. So I wish there was an easy answer for me to give, as far as like, no, it was go read this book and it'll change your life.
Hmm.
It was a lifetime, and I'm still
Hmm.
going through it. And what I've come to discover is people want the end result of what they see from me
Hmm.
without the work putting in. And I don't blame them for that. Like, let's be very clear. Like, trying to get 20 years results in just an afternoon is going to be hard. But I'm trying to get 2000 years plus
Yeah.
in 30 years.
Hmm.
And for me, that desire of like, oh my gosh, there's still more for me to learn. In fact, that's why I'm so appreciative to Kevin, is because he lit that fire back in me. I started to lose that passion of like, there's still more for me to learn, and he lit that fire right back in me. And that, I feel like, needs to be present first, of a desire to learn and self-explore, before you can have what I have, because what I have is the result of that,
Hmm.
not a singular book.
Yeah. No, thanks for sharing. I think it's a much more honest and authentic. It's very easy to chalk it up to one or two things and like, hey, if you click on the link in the bio, I'll get a commission from you clicking on the very books that got me into the faith. Yeah, so I like that. It's a long, hard earned journey. Um, and I guess like the moral of the story is we could all use a little Kevin in our lives.
Yes. Yes. Like,
Mhm.
and what helped me growing up, especially, was only my immediate family was Catholic.
Mhm.
My let me see, or let me rephrase it. My immediate family was Catholic. One of my mom's sisters was Catholic,
Mhm.
and definitely a little more on the trad side than what my mom was. Now, my mom still had very traditional but she was definitely more on the mystical side of things.
Mhm.
Um, her favorite saints were ones who had visions of, I forget the name, but it was someone who is considered to have been like the expert mystic on the life of the Holy Family.
Mhm.
Uh, and then her parents were Catholic, but in the case for my mom and her siblings, they didn't grow up Catholic. Like, my grandparents on her side were, grew up Catholic, but then they just stopped practicing because they got too busy with um with the cap, or like they got too busy with family life to be able to bring about continue raising the kids Catholic, was the excuse that was brought up.
Mhm.
And then my mom had a reversion, and I don't want to go into too much of her life history, but it was about as far away from Christian as you could probably expect. But then she had a revision back to the Christian faith, and her mom said, "Well, if you're going to follow the faith, you were baptized Catholic, so that's what we're going to do. If you decide
Mhm.
after the age of 18 you don't want to do that, that's fine. But until then, we're going to be practicing the Catholic faith." And my dad's side, agnostic. His mom hated Catholics. So when he converted after I was going through my first communion, he never told his mom that he converted to Catholicism.
Mhm.
And so I've had within my family a mix of people that were very pro Catholic, some that were indifferent, and some that were very anti Catholic. So I had to learn how to communicate with these people who knew I was Catholic and respond to their questions and their challenges because I was questioned and challenged growing up because I was unashamedly Catholic.
Mhm.
And that I had to be challenged to drive that fire. And then as I got older, less and less challenges came in. And so I got less and less on fire for it. So yeah, you're absolutely right. We all need a Kevin in our lives.
Yeah. Oh, I was wondering if you could bring something up in the chat from our buddy Pick and Choose.
Yes, I did see
Yeah,
that.
and then he said sorry if that came in
Mhm.
hot. He was just thinking out loud with his thumbs. But yeah, maybe that is a valid question, and maybe you could speak to
Yeah.
that concern.
And I feel like I kind of touched on it a little bit. So the fire of it came, like I said, from the fact that I was exposed to non-Catholic individuals who were challenging me, and I'm like, "Oh, I don't like not having an answer. I'm gonna get an answer." And so I would go and look. And there was definitely a source of pride growing up. And as you've commented, from seeing some of my conversations with Kevin, there's a humility I feel that's now tied to it, where it's less of, "Oh, I don't like having an answer." It's like, "Oh, thank goodness I don't have an answer because now it means that this is an area that I get to look and explore,
Mhm.
and I still have room to learn." And I realized when I went through that period of no one challenging me that I missed it, that I missed that drive to learn. So the fire came not from me, the fire came from those around me telling me that I didn't know or would never know the answer or that they had the answer. And I'm like,
Mhm.
there's no way that I'm wrong and you're right. I'm
Yeah.
going to go find out. So it
Mhm.
definitely started off from a very stubborn in situation,
Yeah.
but the fire, if there was no one there to challenge me, I would have never gotten on fire to go and look.
Mhm. That makes
And
sense.
so and then to clarify, the I started the in-depth when I was 6 as far as, like, that was when I can remember my religious education being a part of my homeschool curriculum. But as far as, like, the self-discovery, that probably started when I was, like, in my 13 or 14, if you wanna talk about the fire. But as far as, like, the actual study, it started when I was 6. Kind of because I was learning about the faith when I was, like, 6 years old through the Baltimore Catechism as, Midnight Philosopher pointed out,
Mhm.
which is a very simplistic
Yeah,
study
it's
of
like
the faith.
giving you the raw ingredients with, like, no
Yeah,
seasoning.
yes. But as far as, like, getting on fire for the faith, yes, it definitely started when I was being challenged by my friends and family,
Mhm.
but I was given the raw ingredients, as you put it, starting when
Mhm.
I was about 6 years old.
Yeah, okay. Very cool. No, that enriches the context that we have for Catholic thinker.
Do you have
Um,
any other, questions, challenges, or anything you wanna share um, from your own
hmm,
experience growing up before we finish it up?
that's a good um, sorry. I'm just,
No, you're
it's like, kind of going through my file cabinet of my very disorganized mental file cabinet. Um,
or do you have something that you think would stump me that would put me on the next, rabbit hole for
oh,
the
that's
next
a
month or 2?
I'm sorry to disappoint you. I think I feel unprepared to stimulate your intellect. But maybe something will come to me. But maybe kind of bringing it back to I think something you had brought about from one of my videos, and maybe it ties into a few things that we've touched on about like I
Mhm.
think my musings in the afterlife and how for me hell was
Yeah.
um separation from my loved ones. and
Yeah.
and and that was, yeah, that was one of my maybe more right-brained musings, not really rooted in sophisticated understanding of the theological tradition. But
Yeah.
maybe one thing it does touch on is kind of like I'd said that, the last few years now, I've kind of had this upsetting realization that maybe I never had a relationship with God, or God has been a series of abstractions, and there's
Right.
um this maybe anxious curiosity of like, should I have a relationship with God? What does that feel like? Maybe I've been going about this the wrong way. Um, and I know this might sound cheesy or hokey or very Disney Channel or something, like, all complexity is reducible to love, in the sense that, if we take Pope Benedict's encyclical, that God is love, literally, and then in some ways the way that I maybe the closest approximation that I have in my own recent experience, my recent, like, conscious adult experience, is really like the love shared, with family and friends, and how
Mhm.
that is maybe as close to concrete as I can get to what might be a right-brained mystical experience of God. and
Yeah.
and that I think for me, my relationship with God and religion, just just speaking from pure experiences, it's so inseparable from the love of my family, and the
Yeah.
sense of cohesion within that most intimate community in my life, and which is
Yeah.
why I can certainly, I can think of it in abstract terms of hell as to be away from the ground of all being, away from the Trinity,
Mhm.
away from the Eucharist, being cut off from sanctifying grace, and all of these things that, all this language that I was brought up on. But in a more immediate, emotional, right brain sense, it's like it's being cut off from the people that I love and that have nourished me and that have made me feel a sense of love and providence and stuff. And I think when I really look for, let's say, clues or whatever, like, are there any
Mhm.
sparks of the divine in my life? And I think it really is like the love share, the human
Yeah.
connection and the love, the beauty from nature, or like
Yep.
seeing the northern lights or something like that, and maybe art and music and all of these, maybe that's me tapping into the more right brain thing, like these little sparks of, or even like serendipitous timing, like, just how you meet certain friends, or how I met my life partner, my wife, and how I've met certain mentors in my journey. And there have been times I reflect on how ridiculously good the timing was of with a particular phase of my life,
Yeah.
and maybe if I'm looking hard enough, I think that, all the sophisticated theology aside, I kind of look at those moments of love and providence as maybe they're hints of the ultimate reality that I could have a relationship with. um so I don't know. That was a long ramble of why I phrased hell in that way in that particular
Yeah.
video, being separated from love. That these are the sort of experiences that I can tap into that seem to gesture towards the highest good, and to be
Right.
separated from that would seem to be hell to me.
Yeah. And the thing is that you're not totally off the mark with it. I know a
Mhm,
lot of people would probably look at that and it's like, "Oh my gosh, like you're completely missing the point." And not you're not totally off the mark. Um, the when you look at the catechism of the Catholic Church in its current state, uh, it every time it talks about heaven, it always includes the communion of saints and that community. That community is such an integral part of heaven and the beatific vision. It's not just you and God.
mhm,
It's you, God, and everybody else. And hell is not, again, not just that separation from God, but that separation from that community.
mhm.
So, yeah, the only thing is like, as you put it, you're trying to find that experience and that relationship with God, and that's the only thing that's missing from your description of heaven. But as far as like the importance of the heaven being that community and hell being that lack of community, yeah, that is absolutely on the mark
Hmm.
as far as theologically accurate. um, you're still exploring what it means to have that relationship with God, but you at least understand that relationship with community, and so you're expressing it. And I did want to praise you on that as far as the what you had mentioned that in the video,
Hmm.
where you know you're like, that's what hell is that exclusion from the community, and it's like, yes, absolutely,
Hmm.
that's it. You got it.
Hmm.
Like, and I I greatly encourage you to read The Great Divorce if you can, because there's at least one, I don't know if there's multiple, but there's at least one individual where they're talking about trying to, because they have a disordered relationship with their son, but they're trying effectively, they love the idea of their son, but they don't actually love their son. And the they are trying to bring their son with them into hell, and when the narrator asks the angel that's leading them, uh you know what's going on, like, wouldn't they be happy, wouldn't they be together in hell, and the angel reveals they'd be in the same proximity, but they wouldn't actually be together. There would be no community
Hmm.
there, and that is uh the nature of hell, is that isolation. So, as we touched on at the beginning of this, like that isolationist aspect within the tradition based communities is, whether it's from the online or whatever, that's the hell on earth.
Yeah, I think it's they've closed off their community, as you said, like because it has become about these identity markers of checking boxes in terms of dogmatic belief and
Mhm.
the externalities of religious expression. And rather than taking those as tools to point them towards the divine, that they've kind of become almost like the end in themselves, even if that's
Yeah,
not their intention.
yeah,
But yeah, I think that was like the nail in the coffin. Like that was expertly stated. Just that that's an expert diagnosis of what's going on with the trads, unfortunately.
yeah. And as far as like, and again, I want to stress, because I did see that, PC, I think, misunderstood what I was trying to get at.
Hmm.
Uh, I wasn't trying to say that you were off the mark as far as like you were wrong, but no, like, or belittle your experience. Like, your experience got you closer to the mark than I think most people would give you credit for. And where it is in line with the Catholic faith, the only thing that it's missing is the recognition of heaven being, having, and containing the beatific vision. But that
Hmm.
wasn't the point of your video.
Hmm.
So, and I understood that. What I was trying to say is, like, you were on the mark. The only thing that would make it even perfect would be the inclusion of the beatific vision. But as far as like your focus on the community aspect, no, that's on the
Hmm.
mark.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that validation. That's very kind and very reassuring. I think maybe another thing. I don't want to end on a sour note, so maybe you can definitely like switch it up and bring it back to a more positive note after it. But kind of um about the trads, like this approach of very much preoccupied with who's in and who's out, that kind
Mhm.
of in terms of belief, and going back to the thing we discussed in the beginning, like the calculations about mortal sin and the state of your
Yeah.
soul. And I think that is like, because instead of just being focused on building and enriching and expanding the community, um I mean, I know that there's a balance between like inclusivity and exclusivity, because I'm not saying that remove all boundaries, remove all beliefs and stuff, but I think when you become so inclusive and closed off that it turns the religious journey into something very anxious.
Mhm.
Because or anxiety driven. It's like, am I
Yeah.
checking all the boxes? Am I cognitively assenting to the right things? um it's like, what are the state of my thoughts and my actions? Do I need to rush to confession again because I might be endangering my soul? And
Yeah.
not only that, now I also have to be anxious on behalf of my loved ones who, in my estimation, are wayward. And now, if I'm inviting them to church or inviting them to the faith, it doesn't come from this loving invitation to discover and encounter something profound,
Yeah.
but it becomes like, I don't want you to end up in the bad place. Like, please come with me. Let's, and I think that's one of the greatest harms to that approach is, um we can easily lose sight of a way to be embark on the religious journey in like you said, like I think when you were discussing how to bring people in when they have no prior experience with religious tradition, but to take it at their own pace, because it's
Yep.
it's 2 millennia of stuff you can't, you know in your 20 plus years, you're basically, you've scratched, maybe you've scratched beneath the surface a couple inches, but like you said, it's limitless, right? And
Yeah.
I think that, I think when you're trying to expedite people's official membership and it comes from a place of anxiety, I think it does great harm to
Hmm.
people's spiritual journeys, but I think it also paints a bad image of what the church has to offer in terms of encountering the divine.
Yeah. And one of the things that I love about Thomas Aquinas is because it is my personal opinion that he really does show. I know he's often portrayed as like the left brain Catholic,
Mhm,
the analytical. But when you really read his life and more than just what he did for the Summa,
mhm,
he's very mystical as well. Um, the hymns that we use for adoration come from Thomas Aquinas.
mhm.
The
Tantum Ergo, I think is by
Yes.
Thomas Aquinas, right?
Yeah, Tantum
Mhm,
Ergo, and then, that's when I believe when it's being exposed, and then when it's being,
mhm,
put to rest, there's another hymn, and that's also by Thomas
mhm,
Aquinas as well. And the the prayers that he would meditate on, and the fact that he had visions and had multiple encounters with Christ, and, everyone knows the story of where he had a glimpse of heaven and then immediately started to burn, his works. And as the rector, the priest in charge of the seminary I was at, said when he was recounting the story once to us, and I'm sure y'all wish that his students didn't stop him. Uh,
mhm,
but he did, even though he devoted his life to the study, he never lost sight of the mystical side of things and understood the limit
mhm,
that the mind and reason had. And when you really look at the faith in that way of like, there it is so much more than just what the mind can express.
mhm.
Like, don't get me wrong, there's a lot that the mind can express about the faith, but the real beauty is in what it can't express and where you're able to just sit and meditate and marinate in it
Mhm,
and let it envelop you.
mhm,
That's where the real beauty of the faith comes in. And that's why it's a personal journey where my journey is going to look different from yours. It's going to look different from my brother's. It's going to look different from everyone else's. It's the same thing as like what makes a healthy marriage. We can list it out in a book, but everyone's marriage is going to be different from everyone else.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to encapsulate that, and I hope that's something that, you can continue to work on, and I hope, and with future collaborations, I think to really explore that approach to Catholicism, of this openness of like we're all hopefully facing the right direction,
Mhm.
and hopefully we don't get turned, X number of degrees off the path. But I think if we could
Yeah,
have like, boil it down to striving for the proper orientation of our
yeah,
journeys instead of like neurotic salvation calculations. and
yeah,
and I think, and like you said, emphasizing like a proper relationship or a seeking of that proper relationship. I think it's healthier for those of us, in the official visible church, but I think it's also something that could hopefully speak to whatever hunger there is in those that aren't in part of our tradition.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Um, I think that's a good ending point there, unless you got any last minute things you want to
No, I
add.
think I think that was a good place. But before we get down in the dumps about more woes from traditionalism, I think that's a good place to end it. But yeah, I really had a lot of fun. Thanks so much for inviting me, James. And if you ever just need another person to collaborate with, I'd love to do this again with
Yeah,
you.
absolutely. We'll talk on Discord, figure out another thing. But thank you so much for accepting my invitation. And thank you for everyone for joining us. And looking forward to next time.
Yeah, take it easy.